Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. I'm Steve, and today we will be covering the running back position in the fourth video in this series of videos, which is based on a series of articles I wrote, which are as much pieces of analysis, I suppose, as they are articles, and those are available and can be seen up on the website at theffforge.com. Link is also down in the description below. Scoring for this analysis today will be based on data that was from half PPR type scoring with decimal points. And I did most of the database analysis for each format. So also I did do some of the primary analysis for full PPR and non-PPR. However, I did not bring all of that in together in the form of an article, thus not coming to some of the final conclusions for those data sets for those types of scoring systems. But there are charts, graphs, the equalized value spreadsheet, as well as the consistency ratings spreadsheets that are all available to patrons. There is a link to the Patreon page down in the description below, as well as up on the website in the upper right hand corner. I think this will be the right hand once this video is done. Starting to learn that the mirror effect that happens with these videos. All of those charts, graphs are available to all Patreons regardless of the donation size. If you would like access to some of that analysis, reach out, let me know what it is specifically you want, and we'll get that taken care of. Other than that, especially if you are looking for other ways to help out, all of those YouTube-y things are amazing and super helpful. You know exactly what they are, so no need to cover them. In today's video, the general structure will go like so. It's broken down into three main portions, beginning with going through the baseline data from 2021, the ceilings, the floors, averages, those types of numbers. And then after that, we will go through a brief walkthrough of how that information is brought together and transformed into season-long expectations for tiers of players, while looking at some of those conclusions and observations that are made along the way. And then afterwards, we'll come back to me on a big face because we will go to the computer screen for much of that. And I will go through an overall summary of any interesting nuggets that I found out about the position, any extra bonus analysis I think will come up in that portion for this video. And there's a general profile for the position that I will kind of be a bit of a recap of some of the things that I've already spoken of, as well as draft specific advice. So that is in the final 20 minutes or so usually of these videos. Alright, so the first thing that we will look at when starting to look at the analysis that I did, like I stated, is looking at some of the base statistics, some of the averages, the lows, highs here, the floors, the ceilings, across the position at different checkpoints where I collected the scoring output, the fantasy points scored at each of these spots every week of the season, and then, did a little bit of maths. Nothing too complex there. If you want to look at these closer, you can check it up on the website. It is available there, or just pause the video. There are two similarities to the tight end position that immediately stand out to me when I am looking at this. Number one is that the floors of the lower ranks each intersect with the ceilings of the higher ranks per the weekly outcomes across the season without any relief like we saw in the tight end. So what I am saying there is, you can see right here, the ceiling for the running back 6 does intersect with the floor for the RB number 1. Or right here, the ceiling for the RB 12 across the season does intersect with the floor for the RB 6. And we will see that that pattern continues across the entirety of the position. The second thing that I want to look at is going to be in regards to these medians and the averages. So when the median is lower than the average, then that means that most weeks the position scored below the average, aka closer to the next lowest rank at the position, more weeks than not, more often than not. So we can see here that the RB1, more weeks than not, scored below average or closer towards like the RB6. And then that happens at the RB6 and the 12. And then at the 18, we can see the position kind of even off before that continues again. So there's this constant pull at the position towards less points than the averages would suggest. An initial observation from that would be that most weeks there are probably fewer than 18 running backs who separate themselves from the rest of the position. A gap forms around the RB18, aka around 13 to 15 fantasy points, probably. So if we go back then to these floors and these ceilings at the RB24's ceiling and then the RB12's floor across the entirety of the season, you can see that they are within less than a point. They are quite close. That is another sign of some sort of bottlenecking of sorts in the weekly fantasy scoring at the position in the range of roughly, I would guesstimate, 15 fantasy points or so. A quick look at the standard deviations here at the bottom will also show a certain amount of swing in the average scoring that settles in by roughly the running back number 24. How this will impact things across the entirety of the season is anybody's guess. No, that is to be determined. These are merely observations and hypotheses that can be created but not verified without digging deeper into the scoring habits of the individuals within the position, and part of that process begins by trying to figure out more accurate expectations. Averages are merely that, and they can be quite misleading. Here we see that every week you can expect the RB1 to be scoring across the season. You can expect them to score 27.5 to 37.5 fantasy points. And then for the RB6 on a weekly basis, you could expect them to score within the range of roughly 19 to 22 fantasy points. The RB12, roughly 15.5 to 17.5 fantasy points. The RB18, roughly 12 to 14.5 or so fantasy points, and so on as you go down. A lot of this analysis boils down to value. One way I determine value within the position, and a way to look across positions to determine which ones are losing more value more quickly, is by looking at the percentage relative change. So we are going to move over here to this portion on the left of the chart where we see relative to the RB1, the RB6 scored on average 38% fewer fantasy points. And as we move down to the RB12, we can see that there is a roughly 18% drop in the production relative to the RB6 for the RB12. And what this basically shows us is how is the position degrading, at what rate is that degradation occurring at different spots as we look throughout the position, how quickly are are the fantasy points dropping off, being shed off of the position. And much like all of the other data, by taking this data and going one step further with it, we come to Value Mountain. Now, the way to quickly best understand Value Mountain right here is that the RB1's output, on average, is 51% more valuable than the tight end 6's output, strictly within the bubble of the top 12 tight ends on average per week. Or the running back 6's output, on average per week, is 11% less valuable than the running back 12's output within the bubble of the RB6 through the RB18. That 11% advantage is about as big of an advantage as you can find among the relevant running backs outside of the RB1 on a weekly basis. And when tested, not only does it not hold up well when simply using the average weekly outcomes, but if we take, for instance, looking at week 14 of 2021. Now, I'm not going to bring anything up on the screen here. So, the RB6 in week 14 of 2021 was Alvin Kamara, who scored 22.5 fantasy points. The RB12 was Derek Gore, who scored 15.9 fantasy points. And the RB18 was David Montgomery, who scored 11.1 fantasy points. Theoretically, according to Value Mountain, Derek Gore should have a higher difference in points scored over David Montgomery than Alvin Kamara has over Derek Gore. However, the reality that week was that Gore had a net negative of 1.8 fantasy points against those two. If you can look at it like if he was playing against the two different opponents, you would have had a net negative there instead of being in a net positive, which is where those value pockets are supposed to be found by something like Value Mountain. And if we do this for every week of the season, the RB12 is in a net negative situation 10 weeks versus being in a positive, like we would like to see to prove this theoretical value, which occurred 7 of the 17 weeks recorded. So not even half of the time did this turn out to be true. If you take all of those net negatives versus the net positives, the negative values also outweigh the positive values. So I came to the conclusion that, or observation at least at this point in the data, that I do not believe that there is any true value to be gained at the running back position until you get to, quote unquote, the RB36 on a weekly basis. In which case, I noted that I don't believe that drafting for value at the position is possible or makes sense. Originally, I felt this went contrary to everything that I thought about the running back position in fantasy football, half PPR. But the more that I think about it, maybe it doesn't actually totally contradict how I've thought about the position. But regardless, we still need to see how the individuals tend to score on average per week to come to any true determinations on how this impacts draft strategy. Just know that it was at this point in my analysis that I realized that I will probably be changing my own draft theory when it comes to this position, and I think that is largely true. It has at least altered it. It is time to transform this data into some sort of tiers that we can then assign draft-relevant strategies and statistics upon. And this begins by transforming the first many pages of analysis into cloisters, which occurs right here. So by taking all of the patterns and trends and observations that I witnessed in the previous pages of analysis, I grouped quote-unquote like weekly outcomes together. In the interest of brevity, I only want to point out one thing here. Remember earlier we felt that there was a quote-unquote gap that formed, most likely prior to the RB18, and probably in that 13 to 15 point fantasy point range. Look no further than cloisters 4 and 5 to see that drop off in production. Right here, 15 to 16 fantasy points would be expected for the fourth cloister, whereas for cloister 5, we're down to 12 to 13.5 points. This is a rather significant drop once you get to that kind of point production. I noted that the RB16 tended to be that turning point, and so right here we can see that, and when I say I noted that under cloister 5 here, that the RB16 really feels like that turning point, and that comes up a lot in this analysis. So simply put, most weeks you're expecting somewhere around 15 running backs to end the week with around 15 fantasy points. Looking closer, you would see that as many as 22 will, or as few as 13 might end the week within 15 fantasy points, but on average, most weeks, thinking around 15 of them. That's kind of your cutoff point for expectations on a weekly basis. The next step in the process is to create our tiers. And I did this by taking my equalized value, which is a chart that I have explained in previous videos at this point, and I'm just going to bypass that portion of this video. The equalized values are available up on the website. But the short of it is, in that process, I take the players from those EV charts, from how they averaged, what area of the position they averaged within. So like the RB12, as you see here, was the 3 best running backs of 2021 averaged the RB12, as I have highlighted there. So I take them and then I smash them into these cloisters, and in that process, sometimes cloisters can be have to be removed, and then that is when those get turned into our tiers. So we see the tier 1 for half PPR running backs is going to be roughly 3 running backs who average the RB12, but none of that matters anymore. And then tier 2 is roughly 1 running back. Joe Mixon, interesting things he did with the data, interesting year he had as far as creating his own little cloister there in the middle of everything. And then tier 3 is 12 running backs. So you see that there are about 4 running backs who really give you a true edge against your opponents. And then you're getting into there being more than enough running backs as RB1s, and that trend will continue as there are 14 running backs in tier 4, making up the RB2s, still in excess of, about 6 or so running backs that will all average across the season within the top 24 running backs. As far as RB3s, flexes, there's another 15 there, so now you're into an excess of 9 players covering all the bases for your running back needs. And so at this point in the data, this is where we see everything come together for our final conclusions. We will not be looking at all of this, it's not mumbo jumbo, but we are strictly looking at the tiers in this video. And this is the point from which we can start to make some real conclusions on draft relevant information. We bolster any observations that we saw earlier. We maybe disprove something that was being thought about the position, can even find any issues that I have with some of the tier creation if they come up. And I don't believe I ever ended up having to go back and just completely rework maybe one position. I reworked the cloisters a little bit after getting to this point in the data. Maybe. We just passed over matrix 1.1. And these are based on the scoring habits of the running backs per their equalized values was 1.1, and then 1.2 here, as we're going to focus on, is the scoring habits based on the tiers. It is interesting if you want to take a closer look specifically at players, if you were to be analyzing players for next season based on data from last season, you can go look at the scoring habits of any player who averaged within the RB15 up here and kind of see how they compare to some other player in a different equalized value. They're not cloisters, they're not tiers, but just range of expected outcomes. So just to quick describe what we are seeing here. For example, tier 1 running backs scored within cloister 1's output in 26% of their games. Now, without going back up and looking at what the output is for cloister 1, that can be a bit cumbersome. So what I did is I broke down what things look like, a more edible way to look at this information, what's gathered, maybe what I feel is kind of most important from it. Bit subjective, so you can always, I provided everything for you to look at things on your own and come to your own conclusions if you would prefer to. But here's what I came to. Tier 1 running backs score 28 plus fantasy points in 4 games this season. And they score between 20 to 25 fantasy points in another 4 games of the season. So roughly half of the games of the season from a tier 1 running back, you can expect at least 20 fantasy points for the most part. And expecting roughly 8 fantasy points or less is only going to happen to those running backs, the tier 1 guys, in roughly 2 games. When we look at tier 2, our freaking Joe Mixon tier, we also can expect 28 fantasy points in 3 games. Not also. We also can expect 20 to 25 fantasy points in 4 games. So very similar output there. However, a little bit of a lower floor there with adding a game of roughly 8 fantasy points or less to his total. So a little bit shaved off of the ceiling for Mixon and a little bit shaved off of the floor for him as well. And then looking at tier 3, most of your starting running backs, we're looking at 1.5 games in a season where they're going to really get you those kinds of big boom games. And then the good, still solid boom games of 20 to 25 points, you can expect that to happen in 4 games. You can expect roughly 8 fantasy points or less in 3 games, just the same as for the second tier. So really, once again, our ceiling is being shaved off. But as far as really bad games or even solid still boom-y games, it was still right there with those starters. And then looking at tier 4, getting to our secondary running backs, there's only about a half a game. You can't even fully expect a 28 plus fantasy point game across the season for these players anymore. And as far as 20 to 25 fantasy points, you're looking at 2.5 games a year on average for those types of guys. Roughly 8 points or less in over 5 games. Now the floor is really creeping in for these guys. The ceiling's almost completely gone, dependent upon, the specific scoring outcomes across the season for each of those guys. And you can look at the rest there. Moving on to, once again, we will just skip over the tougher to read matrix, looking at the tier versus tier advantage / disadvantage matrix. That is exactly what it is. We're looking at how big of an advantage tier 1 might have against tier 2 here. Well, a 12% advantage. What does that mean in terms of fantasy points? About 2.3 fantasy points if you're putting Derrick Henry up against Joe Mixon last season on average. Might be a little bit bigger for Derrick Henry, actually. About 2.3 fantasy points. Ignore the fact that I kept the term cloister, the C's up top there in this chart, please. The kickers had such similar tiers and cloisters that it created this ripple effect in my brain where I had a hard time separating the two in terms of this specific piece of data. And it's just a remnant of that. I didn't get it changed when I made this chart. And so it's still there. So it's simply just tier 1 versus tier 1. Ignore the cloister thing because obviously there is no cloister 1 or 2 that I could compare when we're looking at the tiers. Now, still looking at the chart, when you see this big thick line here, that is me separating the expected starters who you would, most expect to see most commonly throughout the season, separating some of that data from the entirety of the field to look at the advantages and disadvantages found amongst the top 24, quote unquote, but what was it, in excess of like 9 of them, so the top 30, roughly, running backs. That said, a lot happens in season, not even thinking of the impact of bye weeks on who you're going to face, and with names like Mike Davis, Dontrell Hilliard, Sony Michel, Kenyon Drake, Chuba Hubbard, all the way down to a name like Peyton Barber, you're going to see guys within those non-starting tiers 5 and 6, across the season. You're just going to see some of those guys. If not, that's unlucky for you. When looking at their average advantages versus the field, we see that all starting quality players do give you a technical advantage at the position against the field. It is not one that I would prefer to rely upon, but it is technically there. Why wouldn't I want to rely upon it? Well, because at least for those tier 4 guys, against the starters, against the top 4 guys, we're looking at 3 to 5 plus fantasy points that you're expecting to be losing by each and every week. And even against tier 1, tier 3, it looks like it's kind of a crapshoot there. Regardless, it's not, I don't want to be in a position where I'm relying on facing a Mike Davis or a Dontrell Hilliard, and we'll get into it at the end of the video. That's still not a guarantee, of course. These are averages. Speaking of relying upon, the only advantage that I find to be truly reliable based on this matrix would be the top 2 tiers, which I predict to be about 4 running backs in total. We know that. If you want to argue that some of the top end tier 3 players may count, go back up to matrix 1 and remember the fact that there are only 4 running backs who averaged in the RB18, and then, well, things don't appear to be backing up such a claim that those tier 3, that little tier 3 advantage here is something that you would want to be relying upon. It's pretty much non-existent. I did some pretty in-depth bonus analysis, or I shouldn't say it's non-existent, I'm saying it's very, very similar to the rest of the third tier, the RB24s. 21s, sorry. I did some pretty in-depth bonus analysis of the position, and some of that, actually I think I ended up going through all 3 of those pieces of bonus analysis are going to be spread throughout the conclusion of this video. But before doing that, let's check out the Draft Day quickfiles. So, these Draft Day quickfiles are the one thing that you don't want to go through all this analysis, mumbo jumbo, blah blah blah. You just want the hard things that are the hard facts that are gonna help you out in a draft. This is what you can take away from everything that I put through, the multiple pages of analysis after this, technically. But this is the conclusion of all of that. It is much of the information that we just went over. You see those, how many games is scoring so many fantasy points in is right there. There are 2 things that I wanted to look at here, though. So the number of running backs in each tier, I did end up covering that. And the other thing to look at is just on draft day, do you want to be attacking or laying back within specifically these tiers is where this advice goes. So for tier 1, the advice would be to lay back. You're not getting some sort of huge advantage by having the RB1 compared to the RB3 when all is said and done at the end of the year, of course. I did put the wording technically here because you can't take that advice. If you have the 3rd pick, you're probably drafting the 3rd running back to be taken in the draft. There's no purposefully waiting for 1 or 2 running backs to be taken. They just get taken. And tier 2, the advice would be to attack. You're getting a good value. If this tier 2 turns out to exist after I compile 2022 stats into all of this, you're getting some good value. Looking at tier 3, you want to kind of attack at the middle of it. You don't necessarily need the 5th running back off the board to gain any kind of value, if that exists within the position. And then looking at tier 4, attack. But I will actually have some better draft advice compared to this simplified version on screen right now, coming up very shortly, so let's jump to that. I would like to start the conclusion of this position by stating some of the findings that I came through based on some rather extensive bonus analysis that I did. There are 3 bits to it, but I am mostly talking about one right now, and that is, or some of the conclusions that I came to based on that were that I figure that there should be about 60 to 65 running backs on draft day who could play a role on your roster throughout the entirety of the season. And if injuries in 2021 are a reliable predictor for injuries on any given season, then roughly 15 of those running backs won't pan out. Speaking of health, best case scenario, there is a 33%, a 1 in 3 shot that your running back will play in all of their games except for maybe being injured in 1. So 15 or 16 of the 17 games that you would need them for. Worst case scenario, that number may be as low as 15%. Those are both significantly lower percentages than I found out at any of the other positions, and just to give you some perspective, it's like a 50% chance that a tight end the second worst position for health so far. We have wide receivers left. That there's a 50% chance that a tight end will or won't play in 15 or 16 games at least. Well, can't really play in more. About 1/4 of the top 48 running backs were impacted positively or negatively by season-changing injuries. Based on what I considered to be season-changing injuries, a total of 23 fantasy-relevant players were impacted. And I figure that if I'm recalling correctly, that is based off of 7 season-changing injuries, which in part led me to come to this conclusion at the position. Running backs are the hydra of the fantasy football roster. You cut off one head and 2 grow back. Now, let's get to the draft advice. That's the important stuff. There are true elite running backs which are worthy of targeting based on the advantage that they provide you within the position, within the entirety of the running back position. That is the only real advantage that exists among these starters at the position. Generally speaking, with every running back taken, you are losing out on more fantasy points than you stand to gain against a worser running back. So there's just a declining value, I don't know which way to go, a declining value at the position that's pretty darn steady and consistent. So if you like to build a powerhouse of a starting roster for fantasy football, then you want to get a running back as soon as the opportunity presents itself. A good opportunity, mind you, and that is the by-the-book advice, because on the flip side of that, there are 3 main counterpoints. There are major injury concerns at the position. They're a risky asset to hold on to. That's number 1. Number 2, for each injury, you can expect 2 relevant fantasy players to enter the conversation, as I just talked about. And number 3, even if you're getting more fantasy points, I still believe that there are 2 drop-offs in production at the position where weekly advantages can be gained, and those are after the elite few running backs and after tier 4, aka roughly after like 30 running backs. It's that last point, the number 3 there, that led me to do some bonus analysis on how consistently the running backs per tier are winning, losing, or keeping you on par with running backs from other tiers. And ultimately, this analysis is why I worded that third point like I did, because the tiers do matter. So, tier 5 gave you a coin flip to win or stay on par with tier 4, and when comparing tier 4 to tier 3 like that, the same thing can be said. However, in both of those scenarios, the lower tier, so the 5th tier versus the 4th tier, or the 4th tier versus the 3rd tier, only gave you a 25% chance at a decisive victory. So, like I said, the tiers do matter, because staying on par with is a factor that matters within this position, as we will see more. Consistency does not rule the position like it did for the quarterbacks. There is always a chance that any tier can punch up versus a higher tier, but it doesn't happen at a reliable enough rate to to make the tiers more useless or useless in practice. There is a 10 to 30% from the worst to the best that of a decisive victory occurs across all of the tiers when taking like the worst tier versus a better tier. And there is a 25 to 60% chance that the once again from worst to best, that the worst guy will at least be hanging in there against when punching up at the position. So those statistics, much like some of the other positions, suggests that there is always that chance, and it is not the worst chance, but it is not at a high enough rate to be concerned about any weekly advantages seen at these tiers. So, consistency is an issue at the position, even for the best of the running backs, but it is not a big enough issue to eliminate the relevance of the tiers. And this leaves us with a question on how much draft capital is being spent on the position. That's what's left to this puzzle here to figure out how, well, we'll get into it, because in most drafts, there is a feeding frenzy at the position in the first 2 rounds of the draft, and this creates a philosophical quandary, really, for any draft strategy. So, I did another bit of bonus analysis with that in mind, with that question in mind, and there are definitely values to be found based on draft capital. I will have to look at my notes a lot for this portion because it's not as in my memory as some of the other things, and it's very number dependent in some instances here. I really suggest looking at that information, not only at the differences in the expected fantasy points versus like which round at each ADP is being, what those differences are compared to one another, compared to the next ADP, but also to take a good look at the most rightward column, which shows the expected advantage, average advantage / disadvantage of each ADP, because that also brings in a different element to where the values can be found. There's a couple of factors at play within that data. Just a little sneak peek of it. Okay, I guess I lied about having to read a lot off my notes here, but the sneak peek of it is that from the roughly the middle of the 3rd to the middle of the 6th round is what I think is the sweet spot on where to attack at the position, balancing out all of the factors that I just mentioned are within that analysis that I did. In conclusion, zero RB strategy. We're just going to base our conclusion around zero RB strategy, since that's a big, talking point and kind of the opposite, the antithesis of a normal strategy with the running back. But zero RB strategy, I believe, is currently, and I say that specifically, a viable option given the running back landscape in the NFL. Depending on how you implement zero RB strategy, it is potentially even suggestible. Kind of depends how extreme you are with it. As fantasy drafters move away from the frenzy of drafting these early round running backs, which I think is potentially happening. I think I've seen, at least in some of my drafts, where the quarterbacks, there seems to be 1 or 2 creeping up, and same with the tight end position. So I think that the term zero RB should fade away. Probably won't fade away, because I'm sure it's at least the creator of that term's whole brand, probably. On the other hand, as teams begin to employ more multiple backfields, the best at the position will become more valuable, and the rest of them will probably look more like tight ends do, where it's incredibly hard to predict them on a week in and week out basis, and they're very reliant on touchdowns. So half PPR running back position will probably look more like standard running backs. And then full PPR, I think maybe it will become a more clear picture, just because there are different types of running backs that fill in different roles. And as teams may end up becoming more role dependent on what running back is out there, as those carries and touches just get spread across 3 guys, I'm sure the receiving guys will end up becoming a little bit easier to predict, because they'll have that floor that will be more reliable compared to the rest of the running backs. Depending on how far the NFL takes this implementation of multiple running backs, which I think is going to go further than it has so far as of the 2021 season. So ultimately, some variation of hero running back, I think, is advisable. you don't want to miss out on having 2 starters that can be or are like top 30 type running backs. But if you do miss out on those, injuries may bring one onto your roster. And finally, all draft strategies are relevant, in my opinion. It just comes down to not only how well you draft, but also how luck swings for you in that season. But you can at least play the odds by not relying on a top end running back who, with one position left to study here, running backs are by far the least reliable players in terms of availability. So stay water in your draft and understand your league. Understand how the, maybe not necessarily the individuals in your league draft, but at least understand how positions tend to go, because different leagues are different, and that can affect the flow of a draft. So stay liquid, stay water. If you can get an elite running back, they are definitely worth it. But remember, the industry is not the best at identifying the best in the position, and I think that is definitely in part due to the injuries that happen within the position, and also the position's reliance on touchdowns, which is a well-known thing that touchdowns are the least predictable stat, or at least one of the least predictable stats that you can base any future projections on. So nab up the running backs when you can, when the draft capital makes sense, and just keep an eye out to look out for the final video in this series, where I will take up all of these different values and just stack them against each other across positions to see where, by the book, it would be the best to attack positions where they're intersecting of. Just keep an eye out for that video. It should be helpful as long as I have the time to put it together well. Otherwise, I'll do something for it no matter what. That's all I have for today. Peace out. Steve out. Goodbye. I love you. Thank you. Do the YouTubey things.